Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the In Our Image conference. I'm Matthew Booker, Vice President for Scholarly Programs at the National Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's panel. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that to participate in today's discussion with our panel, you'll need to log in to YouTube. You can do that by clicking the blue Sign In button in the upper right-hand corner of the page and entering a Gmail account. This afternoon, we'll be discussing the issue of privacy in an AI-driven world, and I'm delighted to be joined by our distinguished panelists, Nita Farahany, Sarah Igo, and Louis Mulia. Ross Andersen could not join us today. Our first panelist, Nita Farahany, is joining us from Duke University, where she is Robinson O. Everett Professor of Law and Philosophy, Founding Director of the Initiative for Science and Society, Chair of the MA in Bioethics and Science Policy, and Principal Investigator for Duke's Science, Law, and Policy Lab. Nita is an expert on the ethical, legal, and social implications of emerging technologies, and serves as co-editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Journal of Law and the Biosciences, an editorial board member of the American Journal of Bioethics, Neuroscience, and on the board of advisors for Scientific American. Welcome, Nita. Our second presenter is Sarah Igo. She's here from Vanderbilt University, where she is Andrew Jackson Professor of History and Director of the Program in American Studies, as well as the inaugural Faculty Director of E. Bronson Ingram College. Sarah's research focuses on modern American cultural, intellectual, legal, and political history, the history of the human sciences, the sociology of knowledge, and the history of the public sphere. Her most recent award-winning book, The Known Citizen, A History of Privacy in Modern America, traces debates that reshaped the meanings of privacy in the United States from the late 19th century to the current era. Finally, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Louis Mulia, the president of the Burroughs Wellcome Fund. Prior to assuming his current position, he was vice chair for research, A. Graham Mitchell Chair of the Division of Human Genetics, co-director of the Perinatal Institute, and director of the Center for Prevention of Preterm Birth at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, and professor of pediatrics at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. As a researcher, with support from the March of Dimes, his work is focused on addressing issues surrounding premature birth and prenatal testing. So we will start with comments from each of our panelists and then move into a more general discussion. For those of you who are viewing on YouTube, feel free to enter your questions or comments in the chat at any time. I'll be monitoring that portion of the conversation so that we can address as many of them as possible in the time we have allotted. Nita, I'd like to offer you the floor.
Thank you, and thanks for having me today and for hosting this series, which I think is such a terrific series of conversations and such an important and timely series of conversations. And it's nice that we have some benefits that come from the current moment that we're in, that we can all join together from different locales and be able to join together in these important conversations, and do so from the comfort of our own home or offices, wherever people might be. I want to speak a little bit about the kind of coming age of brain technologies and the intersection of brain technologies and artificial intelligence. I'm currently writing a book about this topic that looks at the unprecedented ways in which we can access and change our own brains. And I think that this is a really exciting moment, powered by our new and growing capabilities in artificial intelligence to be able to truly decode what we have traditionally thought of as the black box, the thing that is kind of uniquely, in many people's perspectives, what makes us human, but also uniquely safeguarded by our choices. That is, we choose to share what we want to share. We choose to pick from our brains and decode and to share with other people through our verbal or other physical actions that we share in the world, and how all of that may change in pretty short order. And why I think that matters, because while we're in an era where most people say, privacy is dead and there's no such thing as privacy that exists anymore, I think we all have a sense, and have up until now had a sense, that at the very least, there really is one form of privacy. And that form of privacy is our own personal thoughts, the things that we're thinking or feeling, our own internal experiences, and the way that we interact with one another is really shaped and governed by what we choose to share from our own brains, from our own minds, with other people, rather than what's shared unwillingly and unwittingly with others. So let me start with the exciting part, which is the exciting ways that we can access and change our own brains, and how that's powered by artificial intelligence. So for quite a while now, I mean, going back to probably the late 1990s, early 2000s, researchers from both neuroscience and computer science have been coming together, sometimes in the same person. One of my favorite researchers in that regard is a researcher by the name of Jack Gallant, who's at UC Berkeley, who is both a computer scientist and a neuroscientist, and started using the power of artificial intelligence and algorithms to be able to try to decode the patterns of activity that occur within the brain. And using either very sophisticated modalities like functional magnetic resonance imaging, these are big machines that people would go into, and that the blood flow patterns in the brain could be detected, and training algorithms on what those blood flow patterns mean when doing things like watching movies or listening to stories, so that there could start to be some mapping of those things, to what I would call less sophisticated technology, in that it's more accessible to the average person. Devices like electroencephalography devices, EEG devices, that used to be something that were only available within medical institutions and hospitals, but are now starting to be increasingly made available to consumers, where they might come in the form of a simple headband that has just a single electrode here or behind the ear, and is a dry electrode that doesn't require fluids, and doesn't require saline, it doesn't require any other person to put it on you, or it might be embedded inside of a baseball cap where there's several different electrodes. And what's amazing about the ability to go from these complex machines to these much more simple machines that pick up basic brain activity in the form of electrical signals that the brain emits when we are engaged in any activity. While I'm speaking right now, there are hundreds and thousands of neurons that are firing in my brain. The firing patterns give off tiny electrical discharges, and those patterns can start to be detected through artificial intelligence and decoded to have meaning, and then backwards described. And through these devices, we can start to learn things about our brains that we couldn't previously have accessed directly. Like, I might know that I'm feeling anxious, or I might know that I feel like I've reached a meditative state, but by wearing one of these devices, an EEG-based headband, I can start to see my brain waves that correspond to different things like anxiety or meditation. Even some things like whether I'm in love or lust, or signatures that might suggest that I'm conservative or liberal, or a risk taker or risk avoiding. Lots of basic kinds of behavioral patterns can start to be decoded, because we've been training through very large data sets that we're collecting while people wear these devices, and using the power of machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to decode and map what that means. We can start, even at home, to see patterns of behavior, to be able to access those patterns, and to be able to start to know things about ourselves that we couldn't know previously. I might have sensed that I was in a meditative state, but I could start to achieve it much more easily through neurofeedback. I can start to change what's in my brain through that information, because it turns out that you don't need just drugs. You can use things like neurofeedback, knowledge about your brain activity, to make changes to your brain activity. This is all really exciting, but it isn't just the average person who's at home, who wears a headset, who can access this information. And it isn't just the average person who's at home who's interested in accessing this information. It turns out that companies like Facebook are investing huge amounts of money into developing these kinds of technologies to embed into their new devices for things like AR and VR. And while that's exciting because it might allow people to navigate through virtual spaces simply through the power of thought, that is, you'd wear a device that has EEG electrodes that allow you to think about moving through space, and it would move you through space, or think about left and right instead of moving a joystick left and right. And in response to your brain activity, left and right would be realized. Or think about things like typing a text message and have it decoded from your brain activity rather than having to type it out yourself while driving, or a status update on your Facebook or Insta page that could be decoded from your brain activity, because increasingly these devices are becoming sophisticated enough that instead of just decoding whether or not you're anxious or meditating, we can start to decode simple words, simple faces that you might be seeing, start to reconstruct the complex visual imagery in your mind and start to reconstruct some of the complex language that might be in your mind as well. Now, we're a far ways off still technologically from being able to decode actual thought in real time, but we're starting to be able to do so a little bit more so. It isn't just companies like Facebook, it's also companies like Elon Musk's Neuralink, who has developed small implantable electrodes that would be much more powerful than EEG that lives on the surface of the scalp, which can only pick up electrical activity that emanates to that level. A lot of the information that happens through the electrical activity in your brain is deeper in your brain, and it's harder to pick up with some of the existing devices. Implanted electrodes that were very simple to have implanted into the brain, that's what the goal for somebody like Elon Musk is can we get to the place where we can do that? And can we realize much greater power through our brains? Because some people say we're very good input devices. That is, we receive information well, but we're very poor output devices. We're limited by our bodies and our hands. And what if we weren't? What if you could go directly from your brain to information into the outside world? So companies are doubling and tripling down on being able to provide the technology for this. And governments too are investing huge amounts of money in this, huge amounts of money to be able to decode, detect, access, and improve what's happening in the brain. Militaries have invested tremendous dollars into being able to figure out whether or not we can decode the brain and enable, for example, a single individual to be able to control a swarm of drones instead of a single drone while wearing an EEG device. Well, that would be exciting. It would decrease the number of people that we would need for warfare. It would enable the power of the brain to be able to be realized in much greater regard. But while all of this is exciting, who has access to this information? What does it mean when suddenly your brain is available not just to you to be able to understand and to change, but also corporations to have access to your brain activity, to know when you're anxious and sad, happy or mad, when you have one political leaning versus the next, when you're in love or in lust, when brain changes suggest that you might go into diabetic shock or epileptic seizure. What happens when there's real-time monitoring of the brain? Well, we can look to a country like China to be able to see what some of the early effects of real-time monitoring of the brain are. There's an experiment that was just concluded recently in China in primary schools throughout China, where in partnership with a US-based company that distributed these headsets, children in primary schools were asked to wear these headsets during the school day to monitor their attention. And the teachers in the front of the classroom had a console in front of them that told them about whether or not the students were paying attention or if their mind was wandering. And the information was also being transmitted to the parents and apparently to the state as well. What does it mean for a child to have their brain activity monitored in real time, regardless of whether or not it works? Because there are certainly limitations on how much information you can glean from it. Does a child start to self-censor and change who they are? Is there any such thing as true freedom and creativity, the room and space to fantasize, to ideate, when you believe that even your brain activity is being monitored? If your brain is fair game, if information can be accessed and decoded from your brain, or even your brain changed without you having a set of rights with respect to that information and what can and can't be done with it, what does it mean for the future of our interactions with one another? A lot of the ways in which we define our most interpersonal relationships is by what we share and what we choose to share with other people. Now, a lot of that has changed in the post-privacy world. People can Google and learn a lot about you before they ever meet you, but they can't quite know what's in your mind unless you choose to share it. And how would that change in a world in which the last bastion of freedom, where your brain activity was fair game? I'd say there's a broad set of rights we need to think about, a broad set of liberties that we need to think about with respect to accessing and changing our own brains. Both our own rights to be able to access that information, which exists within a traditional system that doesn't usually give us access directly to our own bodily information, to questions about, are there limits to what kinds of information companies can gather about us, use about us, change about us? How do we think about advertisement in a world in which there's much more direct access to the brain rather than the indirect kind of access? How do we think about manipulation versus autonomy of the brain? All of these are wide open questions in a world in which this exciting technology is coming. It's already on our doorsteps, but it exists and is arriving in a world in which we don't have a unique set of rights that pertain to the brain. I look forward to the conversation and conclude there, looking forward to what my fellow panelists have to say.
Thank you, Nita. Sarah, please take over.
Okay, hello. I am going to just quickly share my screen here, if I can, so that I can show a few slides. Okay. Does that look like it is? Oops. Sorry. Does that look like that's working? Yes?
Yes, looks good.
Terrific. Okay. All right. I'm showing you a photograph of something I'm not going to talk about at all, but I'll explain that in a second. First, let me just say I'm really glad to be here, and I wanted to say how fabulous this set of conversations has been already at the National Humanities Center. I want to thank Matthew Booker for the invitation and for the careful organizing of this event. I also wanted to mention that I just got my second vaccine shot yesterday. And so far all is well, but if I exit quickly, you'll know why. So let me begin by saying that I am an intellectual historian and not at all an expert on artificial intelligence. I just want to make sure that that is clear. But what intrigues me about our panel and about our key questions today about AI, which are often future oriented and about what's coming, is how much it pulls me back into the past and into longstanding debates over how we can and will be known by powerful agents in our society. This is the subject of my recent book on the history of privacy in the United States. And really, in a nutshell, in that book, I argue that calls for privacy and privacy rights over the last century and a half, really, are a kind of index to an ever-shifting boundary between citizens and their society, and particularly the kind of society that developed in the United States over the last century: democratic, capitalist, and information hungry. So here you can think about institutions like state bureaucracies and law enforcement, but also about private entities, the popular press, marketers, private corporations, financial institutions, scientific researchers, psychological experts, brain workers, workplaces, schools, and most recently, data aggregators and proprietary algorithms as all part of a society bent on knowing individuals and populations better. I think AI is really representing in some ways a new facet of this quest and a new set of tools by which to operationalize old desires. Again, to know populations more deeply and in more detail. Okay, so I want to move from a very contemporary image around facial recognition and AI to an older one. A few, I hope, suggestive slides and pictures from the middle 1960s. Which suggest a new kind of public awareness crystallizing around privacy invasions that are at once political and technological. And as Nita was speaking, I was thinking about what the viewers of this Life magazine cover who were worrying about micro miniature bugs would think about, you know, implanted electrodes and drones and everything else that she was talking about. This is 50 years ago, and what is striking to me is that our conversations about AI really recall this period from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. What I see as a really parallel moment of intense discussion and debate about privacy, a period that was marked, like our own, by government scandals, by social turmoil, by deep distrust in established gatekeepers, as well as technological innovations that threaten to probe more deeply and powerfully into individuals' lives. In the mid-1960s, this particular political and technological context would really shift privacy conversations away from the physical and sometimes even the psychological towards data and data privacy. This period would be one in which questions would be raised that really resonate with those that we're asking today. Questions like who was gathering information about individuals and to what end, who would have access to those data and who should have access to those data, including the subjects of the data collection, and what would the consequences of such data collection be for individual citizens and also for society at large and its institutions. Now, the big development here back in the mid-60s to early 70s was not artificial intelligence, although that is starting to certainly appear as a concept, but computerization itself, and specifically the movement of records and other identifying material into computer data banks. You can point to a series of exposés that come out in this period. This one by Vance Packard from 1964 that start to unveil for the American public the kinds of data that are being collected about them and housed in various parts of the society. And what I just want to notice here in the table of contents is the far-ranging problem that Packard is identifying about mounting surveillance, as he puts it. People at their places of employment, the very public lives of public servants, the watch over teachers, what about schools and police state tactics? How safe is thy castle, one's home, from the prying eyes of others? Financial protection, credit bureaus are very much on people's minds in this period. So there's this kind of expose starting to appear. There are also political protests against what had seemed like relatively mundane moves, like the proposal of a national data center in 1965, which will be scuttled by protests from concerned citizens about not any new collections of data, but about merging data that already existed in federal agencies. What I want to underscore is that in the mid-60s, this kind of data collection was not new. What was new was the prospect of computerization, and also, maybe even more importantly, a consciousness about the power of files and the keepers of files to make consequential decisions about millions of citizens, often without their knowledge, and also a new distrust of the keepers of those data. It's also important to note that while the National Data Center was a public plan, it was a plan launched by the federal government, and then, as I mentioned, set aside. Private entities like credit bureaus also came under new scrutiny in this early privacy crisis. The credit industry was the first to become the subject of legislation. This was because many consumers' first brush with the potency of their files came when they were denied insurance or a loan. But things like school records were also a flashpoint for what started to be called the records controversy of the 1960s. And it's worth just noting that before about 1970, the behavioral reports and psychological tests, disciplinary records, and the like that routinely wound up in US public school filing cabinets firmly and really unquestionably belonged to teachers or administrators. They did not belong to students or parents. But this is starting to become an object of controversy and question in the 1960s, the early 70s. As one parent will put it, and this is a quote from one of them, the test scores, personality profiles, and other data that are compiled when a person is 6 years old can and usually do remain on file somewhere for the rest of his life. And the implication was that that record was going to trail behind that person secretly without their knowledge and might imperil their life chances. So parents and pupils only began to think about these data, these records as theirs through the work of grassroots social movements and advocacy organizations. Those concerns would reach policymakers and politicians, really the problem will be framed very clearly and poignantly even, it's one we're still struggling with, as the problem of secret and unaccountable record systems. Again, a problem first debated widely and publicly a half century ago, but which I think shadows this discussion of AI. As one influential report put it, this is from 1973, the report from the Committee on Records, Computers, and the Rights of Citizens. The struggle of individual versus computer is a fixed feature of modern life. This report also noted that the power of pooled files made it possible, and this is a quote from the report, to bring a lifetime of information to bear on any decision about a given individual. So a kind of emergent awareness around the kinds of links and connections that could all be brought together to bear on a decision about a particular individual. Meanwhile, in other arenas, you start to see the texture of this threat emerging in self-help guides and things like that. The brand new Privacy Journal is one interesting place to look. It debuts in 1974, and its purpose was to educate consumers about new threats to their privacy. So this journal starts alerting consumers to things like the new black and white markings appearing on canned and packaged products, also known as the Uniform Product Code. And which, as the journal put it, was the key to a computerized retail system carrying the potential for receptacles of individual financial information or personal purchase patterns. The journal reported on things like closed circuit systems of cameras on city streets, the black magnetic stripes appearing on the back of credit cards, which might be electronically coded with unfavorable information, it was pointed out. And it offered a guide to the coming electronic funds transfer system, projecting a future cashless society that could track, quote, where an individual is in real time, as well as what he is buying every time he makes a financial transaction. So these were often, these kinds of statements and critiques were framed as almost science fiction, but obviously have come to fruition in lots of ways. And that imagination of what was to come, I want to suggest, was already present a half century ago. And of course, critics and policymakers struggled to figure out a solution. This was an era alive to virtual and unauthorized information flows and to the harms of what critics called the record prism. It was an era that named and described modern data surveillance really for the first time. And just one example of that is a landmark book from this period, 1967, Alan Weston's Privacy and Freedom. And the worry palpable in those pages about scientific surveillance over the individual through many, many different means. Some that we don't think about much anymore, things like subliminal advertising, a different kind of mind probing to what Nita was talking about, but relevant here. But others very much still with us in terms of the kind of virtualization of information about ourselves through all the agencies of society. So the focus in the 1960s, increasingly in the 1970s, will really come to rest, not just on data collection per se, but on the data bank, the place where that information would be housed, kept, and merged, analyzed, and eventually mined. Just two examples here, one more scholarly, one more popular, of these new fears about the data bank. On the left there, 1970 study, the Data Bank Society, which warned of rule by the computerocracy and warned of a new technical power that might make George Orwell's vision of a society under surveillance and control a reality. And then on the right, Look Magazine's cover article in June 1968 asked about computer data banks. Do they know too much about you? Sandwiched there in between Rosemary's Baby and the Kennedys. The question posed there was a simple one and a dramatic one. The computer data bank, will it kill your freedom? So this new awareness of hidden record systems shaping Americans' fates and fortunes led in turn to new ways of envisioning privacy, less as a physical border or boundary around the person, but as the ability to control access to information about oneself. This is very much Weston's definition of data privacy in 1967. You start to see people, citizens, individuals described in this era as data subjects, the subjects of data collection. And the solutions to this problem of being a data subject were perhaps not surprising, given what else was going on in the 1960s and 1970s. The civil rights movement, worries about government surveillance, more general concerns about loss of autonomy and control over one's information, as I've just been describing. The solutions proposed to this problem were legal rights and means of redress, access to records about oneself, rights to see and correct one's file, to see what the federal government knew about you. Individual civil liberties were very much seen as the solution, as well as an older kind of privacy right, a property or an ownership claim that one in some sense owned or should co-own one's data with the agencies that collected it. This became the framework for thinking about data protection and for fair information practices. And it created a new sensibility, I would argue, that information that once belonged to corporations or schools or government agencies or science was being re-envisioned as one's own. It was something to which someone had a right. This would lead to new kinds of legislation and new policies in the 1970s, from the Fair Credit Reporting Act of 1970 to the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which all of us academics know as FERPA, to the Milestone Privacy Act of 1974. Here you can see Gerald Ford signing that. These different pieces of legislation came to the same solution. They offered citizens access to their files, albeit through a bureaucratic and cumbersome process, for the very first time. Really just a decade earlier, this kind of access and admission to official records was unimaginable. More subtly, this kind of legislation endorsed individuals' claim to possession of their virtual or datafied selves, those little bits of biography distributed across the society's filing systems. I want to suggest, and open for this to discussion for later, however, that those solutions hatched in the 1970s perhaps even then not matched to the political and technological challenges of their day, are now part of our problem. Even in the 1970s, it was clear that the Privacy Act, which only addressed the data kept on Americans by federal agencies, not private entities, had all kinds of loopholes and weaknesses that would not actually make it particularly easy for people to access their records, for example. But even beyond that, the Privacy Act really gave away the notion that the amount of information, the kind of information that could be collected was on the table. Instead, it moved toward norms of fairness, accuracy, access, and security of files. So the 1970s laws and regulations were first largely ineffective at reining in data collection, and the incentives for both public and private entities to gather, mine, and profit from such information. And second, it's worth noting that given phenomenal advances since then in scraping, mining, and linking data, these protections that were based in individual claims and ownership rights are even more inadequate to the task. So this has led us to question whether we can have any control over identifying details in the face of powerful state agencies and corporate data miners. It leads me to ask, have our data ever, in fact, been ours? Our personal details only become data when someone else extracts them, after all. So that's one point. But more importantly, I think a historical view challenges the idea that our information has ever been primarily private. It suggests that our data are also technically more in our possession today than they were in the past. That is, if you look just at the laws and regulations governing our information. Yet, of course, I don't think that anyone here, probably listening in, believes that we are in right relation to our data. So perhaps it is time to scrap the solutions of the past, grounded in individual rights and ownership, for something else. Our data, which I'll put in quotes, as a collective trust, a carefully guarded public resource, or a social utility, perhaps. What this looks like is something that this historian can't quite yet envision, but I do know that it calls both for a real reckoning with the past and an urgent attention to our informational future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful presentation and provocative question at the end. Lou, I would like to offer you the conch, so to speak.
I'm hoping you can see this now.
It looks great.
Does it look okay?
Yes.
Very good. Well, first, thank you so much for including me in this discussion this afternoon. It is just a super important topic to me personally, and the scholarship that I've heard from both Nita and Sarah has been extraordinary. So I just appreciate this opportunity to contribute. And I think Sarah prefaced her comments by saying she's not an expert in artificial intelligence. I am not either. I am just an enthusiast about artificial intelligence and machine learning, because I think there are extraordinary opportunities around it for what we might be able to learn in the future. And this whole tension between privacy and discovery is something that I hope to talk about today and get Sarah's and Nita's thoughts about, as well as the group that is participating in the discussions this afternoon. So what I thought I would do first is to just talk a little bit about the Burroughs Wellcome Fund, because this is the perspective that I come to this around. The Burroughs Wellcome Fund is an independent nonprofit organization whose mission is to serve and strengthen society by nurturing a diverse group of leaders in biomedical sciences to improve human health through education and empowering discovery in the frontiers of greatest need. So we award about 40 to $50 million in grants every year. This shows the breakdown of the areas we invest in. The biggest area is biomedical sciences, physician scientist development, investment in research that affects human health, infectious diseases, interfaces sciences, reproductive sciences, a big attention to diversity initiatives. But what we have done in the last couple of years is had a specific call out in all of our competitive research programs for thinking about how artificial intelligence and machine learning can be applied to advance discovery in each of these areas. Because I think it capitalizes on information that is out there that can be used to drive new knowledge. And again, the tension is how do we do that without posing privacy risks that I think have been so well articulated by the previous two speakers. So I think the opportunities for AI scientific discovery in the humanities are extraordinary because artificial intelligence allows us to aggregate huge amounts of multidimensional data in real time that are collected in an ongoing fashion that we wouldn't have access to otherwise, that no one human without these computer-assisted analyses can really make sense of. And what it allows us to do is see relationships in data that we didn't see before. And I love this quote by the Nobel laureate, Albert St. Georgi, that states, discovery consists of seeing what everyone else has seen, but thinking what no one else has thought. And I think AI allows us to do that in a non-biased fashion, not by thinking, but by bringing together relationships that we would never be able to do without the ability for the computer-assisted analyses. But I think Steve Jobs' quote, that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts, married with humanities, that yields results that make our hearts sing. And I would argue that it's not only the results that make our hearts sing, but it's the results that keep us from being anxious about the invasions on what have happened, perhaps by allowing access to information we didn't think were being accessed. And I think really from a humanities perspective, as we've heard from Sarah historically and from Nita about thinking about the ability to manipulate the brain, which is our truly last bastion, I think we have to be very careful, and we need careful thinkers to sort through both the opportunities and the potential challenges by doing so. So my personal passion, as was mentioned by Matt at the start, is around pregnancy care. This I will offer as one example of a vision for how artificial intelligence can advance human health. Because there are so many limitations in understanding what determines the timing of birth in women. We have no idea about that really, or any animal for that matter. And animal models do not work well for human pregnancy. We've learned that over the years, that we really think that analyzing human pregnancy is our best avenue for making discovery. And that's because we can routinely capture pregnancy outcomes for both mothers and offsprings in electronic medical record data in both high and low resource settings to capture environmental effects. There will be the opportunity to integrate our genomes in becoming part of our medical record, which is still not routine, but will be so in the future. So you have this enormous insight into our biology that can be mineable as well. Precision medicine approaches to pregnancy are more just than genetics and genomics. We will aggregate social determinants, socioeconomic status, where you live, your geocoding, health behaviors based on internet practices and queries, as well as what's in your medical record, nutritional influences. This can be even things that you don't realize are being gathered, like those who use supermarket credit cards. They record all of that information on what you buy. And then environmental exposures by linking what atmospheric, water, and other conditions are based on what your zip code is and where you live. But what I argue with this will allow us to understand the best preventative strategies for adverse pregnancy outcomes for every mom and baby. And this cartoon just shows on the side that, again, we have the ability to integrate biologic information in terms of genomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, all words about high dimensional data, whether it's DNA, RNA, or metabolites, with medical history and what we call the expososome, all those environmental factors that determine health outcomes, feed that through functional analyses, and then hopefully understand how to treat women better during their pregnancy to prevent adverse outcomes. So what are the challenges and concerns with this? And I think one, are privacy risks. The data collected can be collected with the intention of confidentiality, but there can be privacy breaches which compromise that. And that could result in compromised job opportunities for adverse health issues, genetic conditions, the potential for bullying or coercion based on findings. So there is real concern about insurability, employability, and other things related to breaches that might result by nefarious individuals. And we see that happening all the time with hacks and Zoom meetings and other things. There's an enormous amount of discoverable personal information via internet and social media activity, wearable devices, and purchase practices. This is collected all the time and very much related to, I think, Nita's comments around brain activity, relationships between an individual's pattern of exploring social media or exploring internet web activities with their subsequent outputs that also occur through those venues will allow predictive patterns of influencing people that they didn't even realize would happen, as we see things pop up on our internet searches all the time. And then the information is often decentralized. It's hard to control the quality, and harmonization, integration across different data sets is a problem, which may make interpretations challenged at best and inaccurate at worst. So are there guardrails in place? Have implementations been attempted to limit some of these issues with breaches and privacy disclosure? And the answer is yes. Going back to 1996, I think most people know about HIPAA in terms of medical practice, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which really limited dissemination of personal health information beyond immediate care providers. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008, or GINA, was meant to impede insurance companies from being able to utilize relatively poorly predictive genetic information to limit access to people for insurability in healthcare. And then there's the GDRP, the General Data Protection Regulation of 2016, which has been implemented in the European Union, again, to guard against breaches and export of privacy data to other countries primarily, by making sure everyone has education about what confidentiality and best practices are. Now, this has also impeded the discovery process. So I think it's a double-edged sword. We can increase privacy measures and decrease discovery and potential advances in human health. There have been strategies around this to try to improve and limit issues around privacy disclosure. Some of that involves encryption of data to make it more challenging for hackers to be able to interpret. And then there's consent management. There's explicit consent, meaning you go out, you ask for it, and you get a written approval. There's implicit consent. And then there are some times where there are specific either opportunities to opt in or opt out. There have been strategies to opt out, which means you were going to contribute your data unless you said no. And that turned out to be a big problem because many people did not appreciate that that was the issue and didn't realize their data was being disclosed until that happened. So I think there are opportunities for this. So the provocation I had for our team today and for the audience was that application of AI machine learning to electronic health records web-based health queries, and integration with other big data holds enormous promise, not only for optimizing personalized health planning, but also as a discovery research tool to advance understanding in health and disease. The ability to depopulate data sources from personal identifiers exists, but the possibility of individual discoverability with associated risk will persist as well. So, what level of privacy risk is acceptable in trying to use healthcare data for discovery in the framework of de-identified yet still potentially discoverable information? And then what is the actual risk of discoverability from re-identification of de-identified sources? Can it be used in a harmful way given what we know? And I think there will always be opportunities, especially about these issues of reprogramming behavior for all of us. And I think that is a potential real challenge given many things we've seen in the media these days. So with that, I will stop and thank you for your attention and look forward to the upcoming discussion.
Thank you, Lou, for that stimulating presentation and some interesting thoughts actually to leave us with. I have a few questions that I could ask, but what I would really like to do is allow each of you to interrogate or respond to the others. And after we have a conversation, we can also begin to bring in some of the comments that our YouTube audience is developing. So I guess I might put it like this. Nita or Sarah, if you have responses to Lou, or Lou, if you have responses, anyway, we can do this in all possible permutations. If you have responses, I would ask you just to open up for that conversation now.
I'll just start with a comment, which is, it's funny, the three of us each claim that artificial intelligence is not our primary expertise, and yet it's unavoidable for each of us within our areas of expertise, right? So the thing that's interesting about artificial intelligence is, as a platform technology, it both raises no new issues, right? Because it's all of the existing issues that each of us was already confronting within our own work, but also it's different in kind in some ways rather than just in degree for each of our own issues. And so, in the category of brain decoding technology, it wasn't possible to reach both real time and the level of sophistication and the level of detail that we could reach up until the point at which we had artificial intelligence that enabled that to be possible. And as people thought about issues, Sarah, about data ownership and data privacy and whether or not it was their data, it was in a world in which the kinds of data, the collection of the data and the mining of the data was simply something that couldn't be contemplated by the average individual, right? It was sort of, so it's different in kind rather than just degree, because it was in a totally different world in which we were having those conversations. And for Lewis, as you were thinking about prenatal diagnosis as, the kind of precision with which we can make discoveries, it also changes the nature and the conversation and the point at which people are able to have those conversations during pregnancy and the kinds of things that we can learn about potential offspring that we couldn't learn for decades to come, and the kinds of decisions that people are making and the kinds of information that they're learning about potential others, right? I mean, so in my own pregnancies, the prenatal diagnosis and the genetic testing that I could do at a very early stage meant I could learn information from day one about my children that are about their predispositions, which could shape and change my own perceptions of them. And AI is making that so much more powerful, changing the conversation fundamentally from what we could have even had before. So I'll offer that as a provocation, which is AI changes nothing and everything, because it is not the AI itself, it's the AI and the application in each of the different fields, but it changes everything because it makes possible extensions beyond the limits than any of the conversations we had within our own fields ever thought possible. Many people would simply say, well, okay, we can do this, but I'm not too worried about it because we can never do that. And we can never do that because there's a natural limitation is now gone in the era of artificial intelligence.
Maybe I can just respond to that real briefly with an example of how it's sort of AI, it's big data analysis. But in my own work around trying to understand risk factors in moms that predict their likelihood of having a baby born prematurely. The breakthrough discovery came for us when we partnered with the direct-to-consumer genotyping company 23andMe. So I contacted them and said, do you have any pregnancy outcome information related to the women that have participated in your research studies? And they said, well, let me check. And it turned out they had 44,000 women that answered the question, what was the length of your first pregnancy? And that transformed our whole discovery area, because we went from having about 5,000 women with that information to 45,000 women with that information, which is what you need for true discovery. Those were all individuals that consented to participate and knew that they were answering that question for research purposes. But the ability to do those things in the future without that sort of explicit consent may happen, which will not be necessarily the best thing to do. So I think as we think forward in understanding big data, how to apply artificial intelligence, there's enormous opportunity for discovery, but there are these real risks.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, the keynote of these three little talks is about the tension that you just identified, Lou, the privacy versus discovery or something like that. The incredible potential and the incredible risk or peril of some of these technologies for learning more. I guess one thing that interests me, I was struck by much the same thought, I think, as Nita upon listening to everybody, which is, we're talking about bodies or genomes in one case, about minds in another, and records about another, but they are all entangled and increasingly entangled with one another, and are no longer discrete areas. So that struck me too. But the question that I find that is so frequently unanswered or unasked, maybe, in some of the questions about the discussions about privacy and housing of information, is really, what do we decide, or do we ever decide what not to keep, what not to hold on to, or what kind of expiration dates to put on things? I think it's a hard question for academics to grapple with, because we tend to want to hold on. And I'm a historian. I mean, I'm an archive person, and I think, all knowledge seems useful at some level. But I think one of our problems, at least I'll just speak to US political culture, is that we have not actually had a real public debate about what kinds of information, whether or not they might have some social utility in the end, ought to be kept, how long they ought to be kept, who really ought to be able to keep them. There are, of course, some regulations around those that address some of those questions, but we haven't really had a thoroughgoing public debate about information that we might not want to collect, or that is just simply too risky and not worth worth keeping, because it holds too much potential damage. And I think, we've had a very patchwork, a kind of patchwork attention to these issues, so that certain questions get relegated to just talking about the federal government of the state, or certain things just get relegated to discussions about private commerce, and they need to be brought together because they have brought themselves together in really significant ways. So anyway, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this kind of unasked question, which is, what don't we want to collect? I think there's a kind of tendency out there in public culture to assume that because it already is being collected, or because it's already out there, there's no stopping it. Are there any reasonable ways to think about breaks, if we think there should be breaks, right, on the collection of certain kinds of personal information?
Sarah, it's a great question. And me as a physician scientist, and always having to go through an institutional review board to have everything in terms of research proposals reviewed, they always ask, what are you going to collect? What are you not going to collect? And how long are you going to keep it for? And then what are you going to do with it when you're done with it? The problem is with this, it goes way beyond that. It goes way beyond the sort of controlled guidelines that you have in in academia overall for social and biomedical sciences to be used for profit, to be used subversively, to be used for many positive and negative things. And I think there needs to be policy and legal framework in place that really articulates, what is allowed and what doesn't.
I'd love to follow up on that very question, because as some of you, or perhaps all of you already know, this very morning, the New York Times reported that the European Union has banned a number of uses of artificial intelligence technology. The New York Times quoted the European Commission's Executive Vice President for Digital Policy as saying, quote, "On artificial intelligence, trust is a must, not a nice to have. With these landmark rules, the EU is spearheading the development of new global norms to make sure AI can be trusted," end of quote. So I guess the question I'd have for all of you is, and perhaps especially given the long context that Sarah offered, what would allow this information, this technology to be made trustworthy?
So, I mean, I'll chime in, even though there's a lot of questions that remain about whether, like, how we can make this information trustworthy. The catchword is to begin with is transparency and explainability, right? But transparency, explainability, and auditability, I would say, are all really important factors. I think one of the challenges with artificial intelligence, we saw this early in the COVID pandemic, where there was a huge data set that was generated supposedly from hospitals that was used to try to, validate the use of a particular treatment that was eventually debunked. And that data set went into major publications. I think it was in the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. And it was only by researchers noticing the kind of, okay, where are we in the pandemic? What is this moment in time? How is this data set collected? How does nobody else know about this data set? How are they able to get such rich data? And ask the kinds of questions by looking at the data set that we were able to debunk what was a pretty dangerous set of findings that had particularly significant public health implications. And with artificial intelligence, when you have vast amounts of data that people aren't able to necessarily see or audit or check or validate, it creates problems of trust. You then have those data sets being used in algorithms and used by machine learning, where people don't necessarily know how the machine learning works. And it's generating findings that people can't necessarily validate or oversee or audit or understand. And when you take all of those things together, which is huge amounts of data that can't be easily checked, being operated and and manipulated through or extracted and analyzed through a system that people can't fully understand, generating results that are being used in high stakes decision making in contexts where people cannot fully be able to check and appreciate it, I think you have the recipe for disaster. And so we need better ways to check the data. We need better ways to understand what is happening inside of the algorithms, to be able to audit and have transparency in them. And then we need better ways to be able to explain any findings. And that comes with transparency, but not necessarily, right? Even without transparency, you could have explainability. You could explain findings. So instead of saying, this suggests this image, this radiological image suggests early stage breast cancer, you'd be able to explain how you arrived at that result by saying, look, there are changes in this region. These voxels were the basis for the decision. And then somebody who is a physician or trained or learned in that field could look at it and have a second set of eyes to say, oh, okay, I see how you arrived at that decision. Or if it's in criminal justice and you say, this person ought to be given a higher sentence or should not be released on parole because of the likelihood of recidivating, the data that generated it, that finding would be essential so that it's not just a black box of decision making. So I think all of those things are needed. And we ought to get our feet wet in much lower stakes decision-making before and figure out how we can do that. Transparency, auditability, and explainability in low stakes contexts rather than in high stakes contexts like criminal justice, healthcare, and other settings. Let's get our feet wet. Let's figure out that we can actually regulate and oversee it, develop some trust and understanding of what we're doing before we start applying it in all of these other contexts.
That was a wonderful answer to which I cannot add much, except to say, you know, the other piece to this is not really about AI, and it, you know, it's about politics, and it's about, you know, the potential in the world we're in right now for political trust, you know, to undergird any operation of this sort. And I really think when I started researching privacy, you know, so much of our attention is drawn to technologies, and to technologies as are often the vessel through which we debate privacy matters. But they're often about, in fact, they're always about more than that. They're about decision making, about who's in the seat to make the decisions about what is done with data. It's about the kind of infrastructures that have been developed without a lot of public input and knowledge. Often, I mean, I think exactly what Nita said about the kind of black box of the algorithm is part of the problem here. But it's not just that; it's about the black box of lots of different things, you know, in our politics and about how decisions are being made. More generally, and that's, I'm not just speaking there, of course, about the United States, but about a kind of almost global climate of distrust, loss of faith in governance. So I think governance has to be part of the answer. Better governance, maybe low stakes, you know, governance experiments or something like that to enable people to trust indeed that the people making decisions are making good ones and in the collective good, and also that there is an opportunity for ordinary citizens to weigh into those decisions. I think it's a very, very complex question, this problem of trust, whether in AI or in governance around these technical issues and regulations. As the technologies, of course, get more and more complex, those kind of tenets of transparency, explainability, accessibility, or auditability become more and more difficult, right? We have only to think of the example of privacy policies, which have been an utter failure, right? And disclosure policies in protecting anybody's privacy, but in fact are just a kind of blank check for companies to do what they will with people's data.
No, I think this issue of trust is a really a huge one, and you know, it is a black box for anybody that hasn't done the primary analyses using AI machine learning technologies or techniques on their own data to be able to recapitulate it in any meaningful way. They use what they call training data sets to sort of find the associations, and then a validation data set to replicate it, to show that they get what they got on a separate group of individuals, so that the interpretations are likely to be correct. But it's all based on the starting principles. And that means the foundation could be wrong in terms of the way they generated the algorithm to begin to analyze the data as well. But you know, I do think it is this issue of governance. I mean, what do you do with the information once you have it? And how do you protect people from having it reflect negatively on them from a discovery standpoint? But I think one of the even bigger issues for me around artificial intelligence and machine learning is using individuals' behavioral patterns to essentially, as Nita talked about, reprogram their brains. You know, I think that is very likely to happen. You can envision sort of a very proactive reprogramming profile based on the images that come up every time you do an internet search, based on what your past internet searches have been. And that will reshape the way you formulate your perception of that question for the next time, including areas around law and justice. I remember a colleague of Sarah's at Vanderbilt, Owen Jones, has done much work around neuroimaging and the law specifically around equity and fairness and justice. And, you know, you could really reprogram the way people think about all of that, given the reassessment of big data and presenting information to people in a certain way without their understanding that it's being presented to them.
Sarah asked a quite provocative question, and then I think made an even more provocative proposal in her presentation. And I want to take it up with you a bit. And that is her proposal that rather than further privatizing data, that we might make it more public. And as some context for this, it occurs to me, and I hope the historians, I hope everyone on this panel will correct me, but it seems to me that intrusive data collection is actually in the Constitution in the form of the census, which is extraordinarily intrusive. Census takers come to your home, they count you. I'm talking about the original census. They record your sex, the number of persons in your family, your relationships, your race, and other information. And of course, all of that is necessary, according to the Constitution's framers, in order for a democracy to function, because that is how representation is apportioned, is through the census. So I suppose what I'm asking here, I'm also thinking of other forms of intrusive public data gathering in the 19th and 20th century, like the statistical atlases, which then could, that kind of information about the community of Americans could then be turned actually into a tool for defending rights. For example, by sociologists, the NAACP and so on, who argued for rights on the basis of communal citizenship or collective community suffering. So anyway, where I'm going with this is, I wonder if, just for the purposes of a thought experiment, since we are humanities thinkers in this panel, might you explore Sarah's proposal that we make more public this data? What might that look like? And that's to everyone. Sarah, you can go first if you'd like.
So you'll notice I only posed that question, but didn't try to answer it, because I think it's very hard to get our heads around what something like that would look like. Although I have seen pretty interesting arguments around, for example, making something that Americans now think of, but didn't used to think of as very private, their social security numbers, public, to have a public registry that might itself, cut out a lot of our problems with fraud and identity theft and so forth, right? If you could just look up someone's social security number and reattach it to that person. So there are some proposals out there, real proposals that try to think through this issue of, if data are more public, more accessible to all, more easily verifiable, might we get ourselves out of some of our privacy problems? It's harder to think about that with the kind of information, maybe health genetic information that Lou was talking about, or whatever kind of psychological or brain information, Nita might have been referring to in her presentation, the kind of, I think you called it something like the last bastion of privacy, although it's always been, not always been, but been an area that people fear is more porous, right, and endangered than we think. So it's a little hard to think through what that might mean, but certainly the kind of information that is currently being scraped and mined without people's consent, and consent might be something Lou mentioned that we return to, and that is being monetized and commodified in all kinds of ways, at least that kind of stuff, rather than returning it to people and letting them charge for it, which is another serious proposal that's been put out there. I wonder if instead thinking about it as some sort of social utility, some kind of public good or resource with very tightly kept guidelines and carefully considered rules for use, might be one way to think about this. Sort of like the public utility debates Americans had in the 19th century around certain kinds of natural resources. So those are a couple of of thoughts, not very fully baked.
As long as we're not talking about the brain, I'm in. No, I'm serious, which is, I have struggled a lot on any form of data ownership because I think data is going to flow, right? I mean, every methodology that people have sought to introduce to try to limit the flow of information has failed. De-identification fails, differential privacy fails, introducing noise into data creates real problems for research. And I think people should be incentivized to share data because there's such great insights, right, that we can start to learn. Take the example of the 23andMe study of the insights that we learned just from that small sample. And we'll never realize the promise of precision medicine if people aren't comfortable sharing their genetic data. I still say there, though, Sarah, right, which is still participating in it. And so I think that my preference would be we would shift the conversation toward protections against misuse over protections against the flow of information. But there are certain kinds of information that I think, and I would put brain data in this category, right? There's certain kinds of information that I think are so sensitive that it's not about ownership. It's about autonomy, control, and dignity of the information about the individual that is, kind of fundamental. Like, I think if you don't have a space where you can have freedom of thought, that fundamentally misuse protections can't safeguard you against it. I'm not just worried about misuse. I'm worried about changing the shape of humanity, our interactions with one another, our ability to freely think, ideate, fantasize, create, have dissident thoughts, rise up against tyrannical governments. I mean, all of those things are, there's a space that I think we need there. Many years ago, I was on a panel with somebody who was much younger than I was, of like the next generation thinking about information. And, what he said at the time was like, look, the solution to privacy isn't by trying to hide our information. It's just by flooding the world with noise, right? And, AI can find that needle in the haystack now. You can flood it all you want, and it can pick out every piece of information about you. And that doesn't necessarily protect you from misuse, but it does suggest that like every one of my dirty laundry secrets, if I had out there, and if Sarah had all of her dirty laundry secrets, and Matthew had all of his dirty laundry secrets, and Lewis had all of his dirty laundry secrets, we would realize that if they're not that dirty, because everybody has pretty much the same set of secrets, there might be a few skeletons in the closet, but otherwise we're less likely to be harmed by information. So I'm of a very mixed mind of this. What I think where I've come out on it is that I think there ought to be misuse protections to enable people to share. There ought to be certain kinds of information that people are able to safeguard, not because they own it, not because they have a right to it in the sense of a property right, but a right to exclude others because it is about them and it is fundamental to their autonomy and dignity that they be able to safeguard in some ways that information. And that means coming up with a spectrum of how we deal with information rather than having a sort of everything is for the commons or everything is for the individual kind of approach.
Can I make go ahead, Lou. Go ahead, Lou.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's absolutely right. All information is de-identifiable. I mean, the very large genetic studies that have been published, there were papers that showed you could go back and find, even in aggregate data across hundreds of thousands of individuals, you could narrow it down to the individual that provided that information. The question is, what are the ramifications of that individual being identified? Can there be safeguards put in place around genetic information? And there have been, but that does not mean they will be abused. But then there are these other areas around, again, around personal behaviors, especially, that I think need limitations on how they're collected. And I think governmental policy strategies on what should be allowed that need guardrails around what is acceptable, because it will be used in some way or another.
I was only going to say in response to Nita's comments that I think I get really tangled up in trying to demarcate an area that is more fundamental, I guess, in terms of how we think about privacy. So the brain being more fundamental than, say, I don't know, one's body or physical location, say, or one's medical records, or you could think of lots and lots of different examples of things that are one person thinks of as very, very sensitive and someone else doesn't. And so this gets me thinking about the fundamental pliability of what we think of as private. You know, the example of everybody putting out their dirty laundry is an interesting one, because of course that in a way is what's happened and made certain kinds of information about us less sensitive over time, a process of destigmatization often led by social movements that transform what, things that are were treated as shameful about people that can now be brought out into the open. So you could think about gay rights in that manner. You could think of lots of different movements that have sought to make things that were stigmatized, things to be claimed, right, out in the public sphere. So I'm just, I start getting nervous when I think about one area as being more fundamental to our notions of privacy. I mean, first, I guess, because I'm a historian and I feel like the balance sheet shifts all over the place in terms of what people think is public and what's private. And that's changed really dramatically, even over the last century in the United States. And also something I think both Lou and Nita referred to are the kind of feedback loops in what we are sort of socially sensing creatures, and it's not just brain technologies that change who we are, right? It's all of our social interactions and our debates that change who we are and what we think about things. So I don't know. I don't know if there's an area that could be carved out as distinct in this debate. And that's what I think is so interesting and also vexing about the subject of privacy, is that there's no one line. That line is shifting, moving, and there may be many lines. It's kind of a fractal concept. And again, also different depending on where someone is situated, probably. So yes, there are all kinds of wonderful ways in which sharing data make us collectively better and able to solve certain kinds of social problems. I just think there's no way out of the hard discussions about where the limits are that we want to place on that. And that's maybe just always going to come down to a simple or not a simple, but a kind of test of where our social priorities are, where our politics are on what we're willing to live with, what we're willing to forego in order to discover things, what we're willing not to discover because we care more about privacy.
I'm struck in listening to you, to all of you, how much I'm struck by a theme that I've noticed across the conference panels and presentations, and that is that really artificial intelligence is artificial intelligences in the plural, and that the context, the examples that we give, the place we come from seems so much to influence how we perceive the problems and the potential of this set of technologies. And I'll give an example. I think all of us have been deeply impressed, Nita, by your concept by your statement that our innermost thoughts are the last bastion of, I heard you say something like the private self. And those inward thoughts, of course, are also the great topic of literature. And I'm thinking of Marcel Proust, but also of Judy Blume, right? Who really understood, for me as a kid, the mind of a child. And the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell others, the things we never say, this is a source, one of the great fonts of our great arts. And the reason I bring up this example is that in a previous panel, we had some artists who are experimenting with artificial intelligence. They are using, or perhaps they might say, collaborating with artificial intelligences in the making of art. And I was struck. They were thoughtful and critical, of course, in their, for example, who does the art belong to? They had some fundamental questions, but they were also leaning in pretty hard to using these tools. And so I guess I'm wondering what you think about that. If it's possible for us to have a different set of procedures or approaches or rules or norms for different uses of this technology, or if we need a kind of blanket in our thinking about artificial intelligence.
So I first of all, just in response to Sarah for a moment, and which responds to you as well, I do think we can reach nuance, and it isn't easy to find the different approaches, the different categories of information, what counts as sensitive and what counts as not sensitive, in thinking about information that has been the subject of great literature over time with respect to your private thoughts. So much of your private thoughts can be really interpreted these days through your movement through the world, through the reconstruction of so much of just the digital traces of you. You don't really even have to go to a person's mind to find those things out. You can reconstruct what they're thinking and feeling by monitoring 24/7 their Google searches, their updates, their sleep patterns that they're giving off in their Fitbits and other devices they wear. We can come up with a really complete picture of a person through fragments of information. And so, in some ways I agree with Sarah, which is coming up with the line is, it's fine to say like, okay, brain data is sensitive, but the truth is you can glean so much about a person from so many other ways. But that doesn't mean we can't find nuance. We always do when it comes to technology, right? We always find a way to say that there are morally permissive and permissible approaches and morally impermissible approaches. We as a society, and me as a lawyer, right, we love line drawing, but line drawing is hard, right? It requires hard conversations. It requires thoughtful and deliberate dialogue. It requires democratic deliberation to figure out, like, just last week, I was talking about the creation of chimeras, which put human cells into non-human primates and grew them to 14 to 20 days. And like, is 20 days the limit? Is transfer to an artificial womb the limit? Is born the limit? Are 9 cells the limit, or 50? These aren't easy questions. Like, when does it stop being an animal that is a non-human primate? When does it start to become human and have welfare interests? These are the hard choices we make in ethics, right? These are the hard choices that we have to make as a society. Should we have different rules for when artificial intelligence should be used and shouldn't be used? Who counts as an author, who doesn't? When attribution is appropriate to the artificial intelligence for the artwork and the creation rather than the human being? When it is a truly transcendent piece that there isn't one artist or one author for? Yeah, we have to, right? Artificial intelligence introduces to us a new set of problems and an old set of problems. And the new set of problems that it introduces to us require that we draw some new lines. And we can do that. It's not easy, but we can do that. It requires us really thinking it through, talking it through, debating it as a society, and coming up with it. Blanket prohibition is not the right way. Banning entire categories, banning entire things, that's like a stopgap until we can figure out the nuance. And I get the intuition to just be like, let's just ban that. Somebody's going to go around it. Somewhere in the world, we're interconnected, they're going to go around it. And so the right answer is like, okay, if you need to do that, if you need to take the precautionary approach until you can figure out the nuance, that's fine.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think, again, there's so much potential benefit to be had, but there is extraordinary opportunity for malicious or intent or coercion based on exactly the kind of everyday activities that we all participate in via public engagement. And I think there do have to be considerations that are put around this in terms of, setting a way to assess whether there really is malicious intent or beneficence as a fundamental goal, as there is in human studies research broadly. And now that we have organizations beyond the health profession really doing human subjects research, because that's what this is, for their own private benefit, are they subject to the same kinds of upstream evaluation of what they're going to do, rather than saying they've done it, now was it good or bad? And so how do we implement a means to assess moving forward strategies that companies, that internet providers will provide in terms of data gathering that assure, some equity measure?
Okay, I have all kinds of thoughts swirling around. I'm not going to argue with nuance, definitely, but I do think we tend, in our discussions about new technologies and platforms, to allow the technologies to race ahead and for the public discussion about them to lag behind. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. It's not easy to organize those discussions, or for our politics at the current moment, or maybe ever, to really fashion those conversations in a useful way. So I do think we ought to be talking more often about not maybe bans of whole technologies, but of kinds and categories of information that we think we would do better. We would be better off not collecting, or collecting for shorter amounts of time, or with fewer eyes on them, or what have you. And there's absolutely a kind of unevenness in the rules and regulations about this, as Lou keeps pointing out, right? I mean, the human subjects committees that often vex our, social and behavioral sciences, are, if those were applied to, Facebook or Google or what, right? We would be in a very different place. And I'm reminded that, partly looking backwards, thinking about maybe missteps in American political culture around these questions, there were opportunities to discuss the information gathering rules and regulations of private corporations back in the 1970s. In fact, everybody expected, or many privacy advocates expected, that would be the next big thing after the Privacy Act of 1974. And then the question just gets tabled. And maybe we'd be in a different place right now if that had not, if that hadn't happened. I don't know. But I also want to go back to, it was really sparked by Matthew's comment about literature. I do think we have allowed a little bit our own sense of what privacy is, and even who we are as people, to be defined by our debates of the moment, as if, in fact, our digital traces are what makes us up. I actually don't think that what I buy and where I go and who I talk to, in fact, if you collected everything you could about me, that would in fact give you a complete picture of who I think I am, and of my thoughts and of my kind of interiority. And so there's another way in which I think we have more privacy than we think. And I actually am not convinced that AI or any other kind of development is going to shrink that to nothingness. And that we might, and here's where the humanities, I think, help us most, we might be able to think of ways to re-envision or think about privacy as something more than those digital traces. I actually think that diminishes a kind of long tradition of thinking about what human dignity is made up of, or what selves are composed of.
So we seem to agree on some set of let's call them norms needed for some, at least, artificial intelligences. As it happens, one of our audience members has asked a very, I think, provocative question. They ask, or they say, global norms are absolutely essential. Pardon me. Global norms are absolutely essential to protect people. How will the norms be enforced, and what happens when they are violated? And note they said the word global.
Yeah, it's not easy. Norms can be enforced in lots of different ways, right? Norms could be first soft norms. They can be hard norms, right? So soft norms can be behavioral norms that we try to enforce through things like social pressure and social shaming, but they are not, codified norms. They don't become or carry the force and effect of law. And even if they carry the force and effect of law, they might only do so locally or they might do so internationally via treaty, but they aren't self-executing treaties that have, rules and laws within existing jurisdictions. And even if they do, they could be something like, Lewis pointed out, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which actually has a pretty weak enforcement mechanism because while it gives a private right of action, it doesn't specify to any great degree damages in many contexts. And the damages it does specify are really quite small. And so if an employer acquires your genetic information, quite what can you do about it and what's the remedy that's available to you? And so norms can be enforced in lots of different ways, and they can be violated in lots of different ways. You can adopt an international moratorium on the use of CRISPR in, embryos, and then if one country or one rogue researcher decides to do so anyway, there's no way to prevent that from happening. So, I think what norms do is ideally change the default rules. That is, if the norm is such that it develops that we think it is wrongful to cross a particular line, that doesn't mean you can prevent everybody from doing so. But hopefully what it does is it becomes norm guiding for behavior for researchers. It becomes integrated into new technologies. It becomes the default rule. So if the default rule is privacy for individuals over data that's collected by devices, then the norm would require that there be some on and off switch or something that would give power and control to the individual. And so, how are norms enforced? First, you have to establish the norm. You have to come to some agreement on the norm, and you have to have some universality to the norm. Then you have to figure out, is it a soft or a hard norm? And to the extent that it is one or both, you have to figure out how hard is your hard norm and how specific is your norm and how do you integrate it at every level to make it more more universal. But that's norm shift, especially when you're trying to create a new norm where one doesn't exist. In artificial intelligence, there are norms that exist, right? There are principles of justice that exist, but how those get applied to a specific technology, to a specific problem in a specific application have not yet been developed, and we're developing them as we encounter them. And so that requires a lot of conversation and thoughtful dialogue to figure out what we think the norm is. Is the norm that we don't need to see inside the black box, or is the norm that we do need to see inside the black box? And if so, what does that mean and how is that enforced?
I think the only real thing that I would add to what Nita has said really eloquently is that there probably are instances where you can get to global or international norms more easily than others. I'm just thinking about, and we don't have, we haven't gotten far enough from it yet to know what the effect will be, but something like the GDPR. I mean, an action that one set of states take that will affect because of their, interlocking interests with others might be one way that norms get established, which is different than a kind of some sort of, international agreement about rights. If you think about the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which many signed on to, but didn't, never had teeth to it. That's a different thing than something where the cost of doing business, right, with the European Union is to abide by their privacy policies. So there are probably lots of different channels through which norms get established. Some are going to be, I think the global ones are probably the hardest to establish, but as we know, they're even hard to establish within particular localities and nations. But I do think there might be there might be different levers depending on what kind of regulations we're talking about and whom they affect and in whose interest it is to participate in them. And if one gets excluded somehow from participation in some, kind of social activity, social commercial activity, political activity, if one doesn't follow those norms. So it's a great question, but a really, a tough one.
Yeah, I agree. I think, this establishment of a global strategy is critical because it is a global issue. I mean, the data is going to be coming from everywhere. And you just think about the differences in different cultural perceptions of different areas, coming upon a uniformly agreed upon definition of what that standard is may be easier for some things than others, for sure. And then who really is the presiding body? I mean, for biomedical information, you could think of maybe the World Health Organization or other things, but for some of these other areas, I'm not sure. I'm not sure who would be, the engager that would gain consensus and buy-in and adherence is what I would say in terms of, if you were found to be violating some component, how would you be held accountable and what would you do?
Can I say one thing that just occurred to me, and my mind keeps going back to the 1970s, because it was a moment, I think, like our own in the sense that there are many different, national cultures, polities coming to similar dilemmas at the same time. And this is what allowed fair information practices to be taken up in many different nations in the 1970s, certainly not globally, but a pretty impressive uptake within a very short period of time, establishing a kind of common ground around what fair information practices might be. So there are these attention focusing moments or isomorphisms or something like that, that occur because often of new technologies that create new dilemmas. And it seems to me we might be in the middle of one of those around artificial intelligence or around some other kind of platforms and technologies. Facial recognition is the one that's coming to mind of many different places grappling with fair use or any use of facial recognition technologies. So there are examples that we can look back on of moments of coordination, I guess, though I can't think of any that really are truly global.
That was a particularly interesting question for me from the audience member, because the article that Ross Andersen shared with us from September of 2020 was entitled, at least the web version was entitled, "The Panopticon is Already Here." And it's about the Chinese government's deployment of artificial intelligence and machine learning as part of its surveillance state. And the part that is, I think, most noteworthy from that article is precisely that the Chinese government has been exporting this technology to other authoritarian regimes for a price and perhaps for political favors as well. And so the question of the horse being out of the barn is very much on my mind here. Certain kinds of artificial intelligence for some of the most insidious, or at least the most frightening to many of to many of us, are already at work in the world, already out there, and the creation of norms will come after the fact, as opposed to before they're deployed. Of course, as Nita pointed out, that's often the case with technologies, that things advance faster than regulations or norms can be deployed. There's another rather wonderful question from our audience that I would love to ask you. And it is this: we are under the assumption that we begin with a finite amount of privacy that we then lose to artificial intelligence or some kind of data sucking machine. Is it possible to replace lost privacy, or is it gone forever? A sort of philosophical question here.
I love that question because I think it begins to challenge a really dominant narrative that we have about privacy, at least in American political culture, which is that we used to have it and now we don't, or it's almost gone and we're seeing it vanish. I personally do not subscribe to that view. I think, if you ask someone living in a tiny cloistered community in the 18th century, let's say, in North America, who had their movements and motions, morals regulated by their family or their religious community. They would say that they had less privacy than we do in certain respects today, only in certain respects, of course. And I think it comes down to how we imagine privacy. I think privacy has really shapeshifted. I think in many ways our ideas about privacy over the last century or more have expanded, where it used to really, in the United States, I'm only speaking about here, really was property of white men and bourgeois men at that, has been democratized. I think many more people believe they have a right to privacy, and that's there's something in that. Whether or not they feel it's fully achieved is, of course, something different. I think, people in the United States anyway used to think of privacy much more as a physical matter of a property, a territory that people couldn't enter into. And now we have privacy rights attached to our virtual selves, to our files, to our psyches in some ways, to our, our interiors, and to our decision making. So I actually think privacy is not a defined quantity of something that ebbs and flows. It's something that's constantly changing as we reimagine ourselves and our society. So I do think maybe, I don't know if I'd say privacy could be regained, but I do think privacy is being reinvented. And even in those instances that seem where we have the least privacy, a lot of people, take social media or what people, reveal about themselves in online formats to be that case, right? There are many ways scholars have shown that people are actually protecting their privacy and very vigilant about it as they do so, the kinds of things they reveal, the manner in which they reveal. So I do not think that there is a finite amount of privacy out there. I think, like anything else that we create as human beings, that we are always reimagining what it is. And we're doing that, of course, in dialogue with all these new technologies we're talking about, with new political developments, with new means of sociability, with the ways that we live now. So that's where I would land on that question. But I think that goes against a lot of what the kind of political commentary is, and it's a nostalgic and I think inaccurate view of the kind of privacy people used to have, which was, of course, always not very many people.
Yeah, I would think about another perspective about, whether if you've lost privacy, it's gone forever. And it depends what you mean. I think what happens, if you're interested in, does somebody have information that tells me how I am likely to behave or what my context in the world is? That is a snapshot in time, and it's not static. It's always based on data collected in the past. So, there's always this notion, it may be predictive of what is moving forward, but it's never going to be entirely predictive because we're all changing all the time in terms of where we're going based on our last experiences and what's likely to happen. So there's this temporal lag between what's disclosed or what has been captured and what our next behavior will likely to be. And I think, that is one thing where, again, we can use a little bit of the learning, hopefully, to program safeguards moving forward so that we know how to limit the areas, even in retrospective data capture, that begin to tell about us.
I'm happy to weigh in if you'd like, which is to say, I'm going to take the question from a slightly different perspective. I worry that there are some kinds of privacy that we can't claw back once we give it up. And so it's not that privacy is finite, it's that in some ways there is a one-way directionality of privacy loss. And we see that in moments. So we see it after 9/11 in the United States, where there was a massive kind of new surveillance program that was unveiled, and we never went backwards from that. We didn't say like, oh, that threat is gone now, and so we're going to stop surveilling people. I worry we're in another one of those moments right now in the middle of the pandemic, where everybody walks into a store and they have their temperature taken. You fill out an app every day in order to go to school or to go to work, revealing information about yourselves. And some of them do it well, where they collect the information in information limiting ways. Others don't, where the information is far more specific and detailed than they need. And you can start to predict trends and information about people from that. But even if what we're collecting isn't that meaningful, people are talking about things like vaccine passports and digital identities, which would then collect a tremendous amount of biometric information from us. And we would start to enter restaurants with that biometric card, or start to enter a store with that biometric card. And we normalize that. We start to make it okay. I worry that the pandemic has started to normalize it for people, that somebody will stick a wand in your head, like at your head, and you'll just, agree to it, or that you have to reveal your health information. I'm vaccinated, I'm not vaccinated, I have antibodies, I don't have antibodies, in order to gain access to goods and services in society. And then suddenly that's normal. That's okay. That's what we do. We give our biometric information as a gateway to entry, and we start to give up more and more pieces of ourselves in order to participate in society. So it's not that privacy is finite, it's that there is a directionality of change, which is things that used to be in the private realm are increasingly part of the public realm, and it's hard to get them back into the private realm once we normalize it into the public realm. And so that's why, I'm sort of on my pulpit about the last bastion of freedom, because I see us coming for it. And I think that's it. That's all you've got left. That's all you can hope for at the end of the day, is to be able to have some private reprieve in your thoughts and in your emotions and in your ideas, because I think the rest of it's doomed.
On that doomed note, I do think this is why we need to be, I realize it's utopian to suggest this, but when we are setting up, even the monitoring program at our schools around the pandemic, we always need first to have the conversation about when we take it down. I just think that the end has to be part of the discussion at the beginning, and I'm not saying that I think as someone naive about what it takes to dismantle infrastructures, but if that can be part of our public conversation, that there's a time limit to some of these things when they are responding to a specific threat or social need, as with the pandemic. I think that would be an improvement, let me say it that way, on the way that we're conducting our discussions right now, to always have that in the foreground when we are establishing new kinds of surveillance infrastructures, even ones that we might, maybe especially those that we can see the reason for and can justify for all kinds of reasons.
So I agree with you. That would be lovely. I also agree with you that that's utopian, because we didn't have those conversations before we did so. And it's not just, it's the normalization that I think is the shift, right? You never would have imagined that it would be okay to fill out an app every day, revealing information about whether you have a cough or a headache, or your every, symptom before the pandemic. And now it's just you do it without a second thought. And then there's the broadening. So well before we sunset it, when you have companies who jump on the bandwagon and say ooh, digital passports, that's a new offering, we could be in that space. And go ahead and like upload your vaccine information. And then while we're at it, why don't you just put your ID in there? And then like we could just have a system where you go to a restaurant, instead of having to like give them your ID where they get a bunch of other information about you, it would just say like, yes, you're of age, or no, you're not of age to be able to drink. And wouldn't that be cool? And then you say, oh yeah, that is really convenient. And then you don't have to see like my actual birth date, and you don't have to see my height and my weight and stuff like that. And so, you know, it's like this slow encroachment where people are like, oh, I like that good in service. And it's already been normalized because I've been filling out this app every day for a year. And so if I can like use that as a pass for entry, terrific. And then like cash, who needs it? Like, let's just do it all through the phone. And like, really all of it can be in the phone. And who has all that information, right? And what are they doing with all of that information? So it's like, yeah, it would be great to sunset it, but it's once the like cat is out of the bag, and then everybody jumps on the bandwagon and people are comfortable with giving up that information, it has become normalized, and then it expands. And so, I mean, when I say privacy is doomed, I think it's because, like, you know, it seems like it probably is.
I mean, I don't disagree. I guess I'm trying to think through what it would take, you know, as citizens for us not to simply normalize, you know. Actually, I think history is helpful there, but I also think, you know, I have no idea how effective such programs are, but, you know, teaching our next generations, you know, digital literacy and information politics, and, you know, may have some effect. I think it's true that the directionality seems to more often flow toward, you know, the release of information. On the other hand, I can think of examples, and they're more trivial than the ones that you're laying out, but they do exist, of things that have become more private through advocacy and work and preference and norms, actually. I mean, I'm thinking about the fact that, you know, there used to be public telephone books that everybody's phone number and address were in. And right around the 1970s, that's, you know, people started withdrawing that information, right? Right at the moment when information privacy started becoming more of a political issue and a policy issue. I can think of things like marital status or religious affiliation that used to be public facts about people that got clawed back, and you did not have to reveal those facts about yourself anymore on official documents or employment forms or things like that. So there are instances I can think of where particular pieces of information, because they were thought to be sensitive, because they became part of political argumentation, were returned, at least in some fashion, to the private column. And so that makes me at least a bit hopeful that that we have some agency and some capacity to make those decisions as citizens.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to the point you raised, you know, about it sort of being a one-way street, it's true, we've rarely gone backward from implementing these increased surveillance measures and how they're utilized. AI will be a mechanism by which that could be either beneficially or maliciously used, but those mechanisms did not get put in place serendipitously. I mean, there was always some for the examples you give, there was some public health concern that the risks versus the benefits were weighed against. And again, that's by virtue of our political systems, our sense of mores, how we decide. And sometimes we don't decide as a population or as a community on how to do that as a public. And that's where it probably should be the case, where there's more engagement in terms of where these kinds of levels are set and how they're enacted.
I like that Sarah leaves us with a more optimistic note. I think that's great. No, I really do, because you know, I'm holding on to brain privacy over here, but I mean, I love the idea that we can set new norms. And look, the GDPR tries to do that, right? It tries to say, like, you know, the directionality is in a direction that we find problematic, and likewise, you know, new privacy legislation which could emerge from the United States, the CCPA, right? There are examples of saying, like, look, things have gone unchecked, we're going to put a check on it, or, the OECD guidelines on the, collection of privacy information with respect to best practices of how they ought to be implemented. Those can still be put into place. It's not inevitable that we go in this direction. It does require education. It does require people to not be apathetic about it. It does require people to voice a concern and to recognize the value of privacy. It is possible. I say tongue in cheek that we're doomed, but it is possible. And we do see moves, particularly in new areas of expansion of data monitoring, gathering, and use, that those norms can sometimes then be established to say, wait, that actually does go too far.
Well, we are almost at the end of our time together. And I would just like to point out that in our audience in the chat has been conducting quite an interesting conversation in their own right. This strikes me as such a profoundly humanistic conversation. It makes me very happy to see us talk about rights, about ethics, about history and the context and changing context over time. I'd like to thank you, our panelists, and I'd like to thank everyone who participated in today's conversation. I want to remind everyone about this evening's special session at 7 o'clock Eastern Time with Michael Whitmore, director of the Folger Shakespeare Library, and tomorrow afternoon's concluding conference panel on the future of AI and the humanities, which will be preceded by breakout discussion sessions considering the various topics we've been discussing over the past 14 days. You can find details about these sessions by visiting the conference pages on the center's website, nationalhumanitiescenter.org. And I want to thank you again, panelists, for another stimulating session